In today's story, we'll recount the events of a bizarre paranormal encounter that happened in Latvia during the latter part of the 19th century. This was experienced by an Englishman named W.D. Addison, who was living there with his family at the time. So select a few of your favorite slices of cheese, sit back and enjoy the story. The year was 1884. And the month was February, deep in the heart of a cold Russian winter. W.D. Addison didn't realize it, but he would soon experience a bizarre, unsettling, and unexplained encounter that would be forever etched into his memory. Now, from here on, we'll call him Willie, because that's what his wife called him. Now, Willie and his wife, they lived in Riga, Latvia. That's a port city. It's about 165 miles from the western border of Russia. That's about 267 kilometers. Now, he and his wife were English. About 5 weeks prior to this encounter, his wife had given birth to a baby, so they had a new baby. The family was somewhat well off, and we know this because his wife had the help of a nurse, like a live-in nurse. She stayed there in the house at the time with them. She was there just to help with the baby. So the four of them, they were the only occupants of the house. Now, Willie wasn't in the doghouse or anything like that, but he had been sleeping in a room away from where his wife and baby were sleeping. He wanted to be out of the way because the nurse, she slept in next by his wife in a little room off there, and she was helping his wife with the baby. So he was sleeping on a couch, and it was arranged as a bed in what was known at the time as a drawing room. Now, it's helpful to think of a drawing room as sort of a formal version of what we call a living room. They were mainly used for entertaining guests. Now, this drawing room where he was in, it had 3 windows. It allowed a considerable amount of light to come in. Plus, there was snow covering the ground at this time, and that increased the amount of light that could come in. So in other words, the room was well lit. A person would have been able to see. It wasn't pitch dark, like you would think with no light at all. So in addition to the drawing room, there were 2 other rooms on the floor. The bedroom where his wife and baby slept, and that little room that adjoined the bedroom where his wife and baby slept, where the nurse slept. So the floor was laid out something like this. And remember, it's about 35 feet off the floor, so it's not a ground floor. All right, the property where this house sat was enclosed with a fence. And the gate was always closed at night. Plus, there was a watchman on duty at the time. And the importance of these details, they'll become more clear as we tell the story. Willie felt it important that we know he was not a nervous person. He didn't suffer from any what he called afflictions of the heart. From studying the account, I get the idea that he wanted us to know that he wasn't predisposed to any type of mental illness or things that might cause us to question his state of mind. He was normally a calm, cool character. These kind of things just didn't happen to him. He claimed to be perfectly sound in every way. Furthermore, he stated that he had dined at 6:30 that evening. He'd eaten clear soup, roast mutton, and apple souffle. I'm not sure what souffle is, but that's what he said he ate. As far as what he drank that night, he claims to have drank a half bottle of lager beer and a single glass of sherry. So in other words, he hadn't consumed anything that might cause him to see things that weren't there. That's what he wants us to know. He goes on by telling us he was an unusually sound sleeper, not prone to waking in the night. He usually slept through the entire night without any trouble. Now on this night, he slept into bed around 10 o'clock, and he claims he fell asleep immediately, which was his thing. That's what he always did. Rather than sleeping soundly the entire night as usual, though, he woke up to what he described as a dim consciousness, like feeling as though somebody had called his name. Quickly coming to his senses, he heard the faint whisper of his name again, like someone had gently whispered, "Willie, Willie," like someone was trying to get his attention. Now, the nurse had been ill that day, so Willie had been helping his wife with the baby more than usual. Because of this, he just thought his wife must be calling him, needing him to help her more with the baby. Also, she was the only person who addressed him as Willie. And here's another really interesting detail. Willie said the name was spoken with the same English and English accent he would have heard from his wife. Now remember, this took place in Latvia, where most people spoke Latvian or Russian. I would imagine even his wife's nurse probably spoke one of those languages. Now, his eyes were becoming better into focus from sleeping, and Willie looked up to this shadowy figure he thought was his wife. And the figure was at the foot of his bed, or the makeshift bed. Still believing the person to be his wife, he just said, "What is up?" And he was speaking in English because that's how he would normally converse with his wife. But that figure, it just looked at him. Or it didn't look at him. It didn't see eyes. It didn't do anything. It remained motionless. It didn't react to him. Nothing. But he says that as he got a better look at it and he started looking at it a little closer, he noticed that it looked like it had a gray shawl over its shoulders. And he said its height, if you could call it height, its height was much shorter than what his wife would have been. So now he's really beginning to wonder what's going on here. He's thinking, okay, that's not my wife. But he recalls at the time he wasn't afraid. I'm not sure why, but he wants us to know he wasn't afraid. But he continued to gaze at the figure, sort of thinking, really wasn't thinking supernaturally, but more confused. But he didn't feel threatened or anything. So silently, kind of just looking at this thing, he decided to address it again, but this time in Latvian, and he said, "What do you want?" But again, there's no reaction, no verbal reaction, no movement, no anything from whatever this is. Now, determined to get a better look, Willie decided to reach back. There's a table behind him, he's laying, so he reaches back to get some matches and a candle, but he didn't want to take his eyes off that thing. So he's looking right at it like this, reaching back. Before he could get the candle and the matches and get everything lit, this thing starts sort of moving backwards toward the window. There's a window like directly back behind this thing, and it kind of moved back, and there's a window, and he says that it disappeared like right there. So he gets the candle lit, he jumps out of bed, he runs over there where this thing was, but there's nothing there. Now there's a door, the door that's like the entryway to the floor. He while he's up, he checks the door, it's locked, nothing could have come in. From there, his thoughts turn to his wife and child, and he goes back, he goes to their door, didn't really want to bother them. And he wasn't freaked out at this time. So he listened at the door, and he could hear his wife up with the baby. At this point, he describes his wife a little bit as a very strong-minded person. She expressed astonishment at the story, but she wasn't really reacting or concerned about what he thought he had seen. She was more concerned about him, because this is not like him at all. From there, she goes ahead, she asks him, "Hey, well, are you going to be afraid to go back in there, And I don't know if he's being macho or what, but he just says, no, he's going to go right back to bed. And he claims to have just gone right back to bed and went right back to sleep. So I'm assuming that's probably what happened. He went right back to sleep. But rather than sleeping all the way like he normally would, he's suddenly awake again, out of nowhere. He's wide awake. But this time, instead of facing the foot of the bed when he woke up, he's laying on his side. And he sees this dark thing again. Now, he's laying on his side, and to the side is a window also. The shadowy figure was like silhouetted against the window, but between him and the window. This time, he feels threatened. And so from there, He reaches back to the table again, but still not willing to take his eyes off this thing. He's wanting to grab the matches and the candle to see what this is. But in doing so, his hand struck the table such that he knocked the table over. His watch, his keys, the candle, everything kind of went flying. So he doesn't have the candle, he doesn't have anything. He's feeling threatened, so he just grabs what he could. He like grabs the bedclothes, as they called them back then. He grabs the sheets, as I would call them, and kind of pushed them up and rolled out of bed and just kind of forced himself at this thing. And before he could even realize what happened, he says he sort of crashed into a couch there. The couch is up against the wall, towards the wall with the window, towards where he's going. And he sort of crashed into that with his hands there. He didn't really realize it at the time, but he had gone right through this thing. And so, reflecting back on the situation, really stated that he thought that by smothering the head of his assailant with those sheets, he could best repel the attack he was feeling threatened by. Immediately, he spun back around and he found himself completely immersed in the darkness. It's like he was right in the middle of it now. He says he couldn't move. And the sheets that he once was holding out were now kind of laying over his arm, his left arm, but his right arm was free. But he describes the feeling of being in this thing as being like pressed down by a huge numbing weight. He goes on to say he was completely helpless. He attempted to call for help, but he said, like, for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be helpless and speechless because he could barely squeak out a sound. He couldn't say anything. So after what seemed like minutes of struggle, he doesn't know how much time actually passed. That's just what it felt like. He managed to utter what he described as like a muddled sound of a half prayer, half cry for help. Well, it was at that exact moment that he described what he said felt to him like an electric shock, and suddenly his arms were free. He wasn't feeling that weight. And he describes the release like as if he had pulled himself out of something. And he goes back over to his wife, and at the room where his wife and baby are. The odd thing, the way he was feeling at the time, when he got in there with his wife, he says that the fear had gone. I'm sure his adrenaline was pumping. All his energy was drained. Even his energy to be afraid was drained. He described it as if he had like run miles and miles and miles for his life, and that he would just spent every little piece of mental and physical energy he had was gone. But his heart was hammering from the adrenaline. He was drenched in sweat. He just states that his wife was a witness to how he felt. Willie goes on to say that he has no idea what he saw. He doesn't even like to use the G word, or why he saw it and why it might have been there. What he doesn't have any idea. He knows it wasn't a dream. He doesn't know what it was. You know how something like this happens to people, or I mean, if it happened to me, I probably wouldn't want to tell anybody. I might, but if you tell people, you might think, oh man, they're going to all think I'm crazy. Or if you tell them, there other people are going to try to tell anybody that, they run across, because they just have to tell them. But, well, Willie fell into the latter category. He had to tell everyone about this. It was just so bizarre, and he was trying to figure out if anyone else had ever experienced it or anything. So eventually, word of this little thing that happened to him made its way back around to the people who previously occupied this house where he was staying. And they told Willie that they once had a lady look after the house for them because they had gone away. Actually, they went to spend some time by the ocean. The lady, according to them, that she had declared the room haunted and refused to stay in it. Apparently the previous summer, while these people were vacationing by the sea, this lady, respectable older lady, good reputation as a caretaker of property and things, well, she was staying in that same drawing room where Willie was sleeping. And as she was fastening up the windows, before going to bed, she describes something that she didn't know what it was, but it was just sort of a shadowy figure passed through the room. And At that same moment, she describes a panic that just came over her. She ran out of the room, and since it was summer, she ended up staying on the steps of the house. She had a job to do. She wasn't going to leave, but she was not going back in the house either. That's how terrified she was. So Willie wasn't the only person to experience something bizarre. He concludes this account by saying some of his friends tried to say, "Oh, you just were dreaming or a nightmare." He said, no, that's obviously not what had happened, but he didn't know what happened. He didn't know why it happened, but like all these things, there's no way to prove it happened, no way to prove it didn't happen. But apparently there's things that happen that are mysterious, and whether they're true or not, he can claim they're true. Some people may claim they're not.